True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with Sam.
The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Brad Hunter has spent over 30 years writing about some of America's more horrific crimes. In this new book, he enters the mind of John Wayne Gacy, the real-life killer clown, often said to be the inspiration for Stephen King's evil Pennywise in It. Gacy lured victims to his home with the promise of work or a warm bed and then duped them into putting on handcuffs, claiming he wanted to show them a magic trick. He would then rape and torture his victims before killing them by suffocating or strangling them. 26 were buried in the crawl space beneath his home. Others were buried elsewhere on his property, while a handful were dumped in the Des Plaines River. Gacy was executed for his crimes in 1994, but many questions remain unanswered. How many victims were there? Did Gacy act alone? And what drove John Wayne Gacy to murder? What caused the seemingly normal Gacy to sexually assault, torture, and murder at least 33 young men and boys? Drawing on his many years' experience investigating and interviewing perpetrators of terrible crimes, Hunter seeks to understand what drove Gacy to unleash a reign of terror in suburban Chicago. The book that we're featuring this evening is Inside the Mind of John Wayne Gacy, the real-life killer clown, with my special guest, journalist and author, Brad Hunter. Welcome to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, Brad Hunter.
Good to be here, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And very timely to have something about John Wayne Gacy, something new for people to read. Thank you so much for this interview. Let's start right away with John Wayne Gacy, his father, John Stanley Gacy, and he was in World War I. Tell us about John Stanley Gacy before he entered the war and what happened and what was he like when he returned?
Well, people said that John Stanley Gacy was a fairly normal guy. He's quite a bright guy, fairly industrious and with even-tempered before he went off to the killing fields of Europe in the First World War. He enlisted and was sent overseas and reportedly saw a significant amount of carnage while he was fighting on the Western Front. When he returns to America, he is, as many people are who endure that kind of horror, he was a changed man, shorter tempered and just not as pleasant as he had been.
You talk about alcoholism, though, that plagued that marriage, and he was characterized as being quite abusive and was haunted by his time in World War I.
Yeah, well, pretty much every evening. I mean, he married fairly late, but for the time anyways. But, every evening he would go into the basement of his nice, neat home in Chicago and get blasted. And, down would go a reasonably normal, sane person and up would come a monster. I mean, John Wayne Gacy himself, had seen his mother slugged around by John Stanley and her dentures flying through the air. And that was also something that, he bore the brunt of as well. And obviously it played some role in the development of his character.
You write that early on he was sickly, he had a heart condition, and so he was told not to participate in any sports at school whatsoever. And some of the things that he was drawn to were in opposition to what his father thought was a masculine thing to do. Can you explain?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think John Stanley Gacy's view of manhood was significantly different than what we might see today. He named John Wayne after the movie star who was famous tough guy and swashbuckling, even though he didn't serve in the war. But yeah, and so he had his image of manliness, whereas his only son, was interested in baking and hanging around with his mothers and sisters and being in the kitchen and sewing and things like that. Things that in the 1940s America, that wouldn't have been necessarily seen as the way to go, particularly as him being a sickly child and less than robust. His father, and I would certainly say probably a large part due to his boozing, he would sit and stew about his son down in the basement. He'd come up and he'd hit him. And Gacy, got caught wearing his mother's clothes, once and for a number of times. And that, of course, needless to say, didn't fly well. And, he point blank, called him a sissy and any other epithet that, may target his masculinity.
You write, too, that he was plagued by passing out or fainting, and his father thought that he was just a hypochondriac and didn't add to his masculinity whatsoever. So when he was 20 years old in 1962, you write that he took off to Las Vegas. He knew he had a cousin there, but even there he passed out in his car, overheated, and was taken to the hospital. However, he did find work there, and he did find his cousin, who was a prostitute. And so he did find out a life outside the one from his own oppressive family, and even got a job there for a time at a mortuary, and did experience something sexual as a result at that morgue, as you write.
Yeah, Gacy got a job at a morgue. He lived with his cousin for a while, his hooker cousin for a while in Vegas, and he got a job at a morgue. And one evening, I can't remember whether he was sleeping there or whether he was working there, sleeping overnight there. He crawled into the casket of a young man who'd been killed in an accident and was sexually excited. Gacy himself later said that he was sexually excited by the incident. And, that seems to be putting him, starting to be putting on the path. I don't know, too many 20-year-olds who want to climb into a casket with a dead body for sexual reasons. So, yeah, he gets going around this time. I mean, obviously, over the years, it becomes clear that he's a man at war with himself, as to his true nature and what America would have expected in the early to mid 1960s.
You write, though, that he returns to Chicago a few months later and he enrolls in college and he takes business courses and works in sales in nearby Springfield. He dresses well. He utilizes jewelry and cufflinks, and he's a masterful fundraiser, it ends up. He's organizing charity shows, incredibly involving the band The Kinks from England. and he lived with his aunt and uncle, and that's where he met Marilyn Myers, a wealthy businessman's daughter, and they were married in 1964. And you write, around that same time, however, he had his first homosexual encounter. And you write that he became involved with the JCs. Tell us what the JCs were for those people that don't know what service clubs were. And what did Gacy manage to do and how?
Well, the JCs were, as you say, a service club of the time, with their emphasis on young businessmen under 40, up-and-comers who wanted to network, make a name for themselves, and do, something charitable, obviously in these things. And at that time, there was a significant amount of boozing and partying involved. And Gacy threw himself fully into the JCs and saw it as a way to network and become bigger than he actually was. And certainly for him, it did help that he became very well known in the JCs.
At the same time, his father-in-law is wealthy, and he owns 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises. And so he gives this opportunity of a lifetime to his son-in-law, even though he doesn't really like him too much, but he still wants him to manage this KFC restaurant in Waterloo, Iowa. And so he gives him the equivalent of a home and salary worth $130,000 today. You right?
Yes,
and
that's correct.
He is successful. He's socializing. He's organizing theme parties. He's a successful fundraiser and works with the JCs. He knows a lot of people. He's networking with a lot of people. And he has a fascination with the police, as you write, and joins a volunteer force that just supervises businesses at night, taking the pressure off the police force, the real police force, as you say. But it also enabled him to get some paraphernalia and a car that sort of looked like a police car and a red light and siren, so that he used in sort of a comedic bit. But as you write, sort of a foreshadowing of things to come.
Yeah. What you see in Waterloo is, making that kind of money at that time and place, with a lovely young wife at home, that would be enough. But you see the emergence in Waterloo also, not only of Gacy the monster, but as Gacy the bullshitter. He insisted that people call him Colonel after Colonel Harlan Sanders, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And he was a real colonel, and which, of course, was a mail order sort of thing that he sent off that says, and that's what a Kentucky colonel is. You can send off in the mail and say, hey, I want to be a Kentucky colonel. And then, he was a Kentucky colonel. So you see the emergence of Gacy here as the BSer, as the fabulist. And the police stuff is also part of that. And, he would drive fast through the streets of Waterloo. He did that at a JC's convention in Phoenix as well, that when he started packing a gun, and he took the role of auxiliary police officer extremely seriously. And I think maybe, he wasn't self-aware enough to realize that what he was doing was that he was practicing the routine that would terrorize Chicago years later.
You're right that he would have boys over at his home, even when he was at this KFC, and he would have pool, let them play pool. But also at the time, you're right, for people that don't know, pornography was sort of a thing that very few people had access to. So it was a big thing that you might be able to entice young men to be able to come over and watch some porn. But also he would come on to the boys, and then if they rebuffed him, he would chalk it up to that he was just joking. But a fellow JC's son named Donald, who was 15 years old, again, he offered him to watch some porn, and the boy came over and he was attacked by Gacy. Tell us about these May 1968, and just previous to this, that his father had told him, son, John, I was wrong about you. And now May 1968, and he has sodomy charges.
Well, yeah, he was married in 1964, and the John Stanley Gacy, he starts having two children, a boy and a girl. And the John Stanley Gacy, and his son is very successful. These are the fulfillment of his deepest wishes. And so riding around Waterloo in John Wayne Gacy's brand new Oldsmobile, father, finally admits, well, John, I was wrong about you. And he basically apologized, and they talked about many things and whatnot, but that meant a lot to Gacy at the time, but not enough for him to sail straight. I mean, unbeknownst to everybody, he would have these boys over, as you say, and one fellow JC's member, Gacy, saw him out on the street after the boy had an argument with his father or something like that, and Gacy, came off like big brother, get in the car, your dad's all right, and then he got out the booze and the porn, and one thing led to another. But the kid flipped it on Gacy and starts blackmailing him. And Gacy, of course, doesn't like this at all, because at this point, too, he's making plans, mulling going into politics, because this is something that he's developed an interest in. And, it's something, the only thing that he still remained at odds with his father, who's a staunch Republican, and Gacy was a Democrat. But Gacy at this time, he's seriously considering running for council, and then maybe mayor, and then maybe Congress in Waterloo, Iowa. Well, here's this kid who he's paying off and buying guitars for and different things like that, who's going to ruin everything. And, it pretty much does. Police arrest Gacy, and then it comes out, other incidents come out, and Gacy told everyone he was innocent. And oddly enough, a lot of people believed him until the jury came back with the guilty verdict. And people found it very difficult to believe. And you look around and read and talk to people and whatnot. There's a lot of people that are still in shock that the Gacy they knew was this monster.
It's interesting too at that point that another person comes forward with another complaint shortly after that, Mark Miller. And he had worked at the KFC, and that he was attacked, and Gacy let him go. And so he hired someone, this Dwight Anderson, another worker, to beat up Miller for $300. And then this Dwight Anderson eventually told police that, well, Gacy hired me to beat up this guy. So then now he needs a psychiatric evaluation. And at that time, he's diagnosed with antisocial personality, but he still denies any responsibility for anything these boys say whatsoever. And the judge, he thinks he might get a reasonable, lenient sentence. However, the judge gives him a 10-year sentence, doesn't he?
Yeah, he sends away Gacy for 10 years, which, shocked everyone. Certainly it shocked John Wayne Gacy. But Gacy turns out, he gets thrown into the, Iowa State Prison. But, Gacy, as is his nature, or was his nature, he would take lemons and turn them into lemonade. And so he becomes, the head cook, model prisoner. He establishes a JC's chapter of All Bloody Things in the Slammer, which, is packed with people. And, he arranges for the construction of a mini putt course in the prison grounds. So nobody really knows too much about what Gacy got up to or why he's there, but he becomes a model prisoner. And it was during this time, I think Christmas Day, 1969, that John Stanley Gacy died. Isn't clear. I'm not sure whether it was cirrhosis or a heart attack, but he dies. John Stanley Gacy dies. Gacy desperately wants to go to the funeral, but that idea is torpedoed, which is, interesting enough, because he hadn't been in that long. I think probably a year later they would have let him go. But he gets sprung. He doesn't get sprung for his father's funeral, but he isn't in jail very long. As I said, he makes the absolute best of the situation. And, those were times, that during that time, America was taking a look at the justice system on how harsh penalties were. And the culmination of it was the suspension of the death penalty in 1972. And Gacy benefited from this. And I think out of a 10-year sentence, I think he served 3 years.
Yeah, even less. He is paroled June 1970, and his father-in-law is appalled, you write, that he was out so soon. But he's offered a job in Iowa, but he says, well, I'll be back to Waterloo, but in a few days. But he never moves. He never comes back, and he moves in with his mother, and he gets a job at a restaurant and starts becoming successful. At the same time, you write about the 70s and the sort of social scene that went on at that time, and people did risky behavior, what we would consider risky now, hitchhiking. And so there was a pickup scene, and the sexual mores were lightened. And so it was a different time, wasn't it? And meeting people and picking up people, especially the people that Gacy targeted, was easy at that time.
Well, yeah. And young America was on the move and they were hitchhiking, which, when's the last time you saw a hitchhiker, Dan?
Mm-hmm.
And, they were hitchhiking, they were taking buses and trains and so, kids were running away all the time then in a way you don't, really see now. And they were hitting the road. And one of the, east, west, north, south depots was the Greyhound station in Chicago, which was opened, not 20 years before as a model of the modern bus terminal, but, had since gone to seed with prostitutes and drugs and, rubbies and that sort of stuff. So it was a fairly seedy scene. But these were the people that would often become targets of John Wayne Gacy were what one expert calls the missing, right? Because you can't report somebody missing if you don't know they're missing. So if you don't even know they're missing, who's going to miss them? And obviously, record keeping and things like that at that time was significantly less spotty. So that provided Gacy with a target-rich environment, easy hunting grounds, in Chicago and to be frank, throughout, on the highways and byways of the country, anytime you saw a young man with a thumb out, it was, he was a target.
You're right that there were complaints, though, from somebody that he did pick up 1971 in February. But when cops questioned Gacy, he had the answers and said, oh, he's just trying to blackmail me. Those charges were dropped. His mother lent him the money to buy a house, and the infamous 8213 Summerdale Avenue in Cook County. He bought the house and his mom moved in. And soon after, the recently divorced Carol Hoff moved in with her 2 daughters and moved in. But you write that everything looked great. He was great to the daughters. He thought that he had bowled her over. He had swept her away. And yet January 2nd, 1972, Greyhound busboy murder. He killed for the first time soon after January 2nd, 1972. Timothy Jack McCoy.
Timothy Jack McCoy was, as I just said, he was on his way from relatives in Michigan, I believe, home to Omaha, Nebraska. And the killing was actually by accident, but Gacy picked him up at the Greyhound terminal in Chicago, took him back to the house. I'm not sure where Marion Gacy, his mother, was, but took him back to, the house in the Plains and, with the offer of a warm bed, we'll put you back on the bus in the morning sort of thing. Well, they ended up having sex. Now, Gacy thought he was threatening him, and the kid was making breakfast standing there with a knife. And that's what, the kid was doing. And Gacy attacked him and stabbed him. I don't think that necessarily his, intention when he picked up the boy in the bus station was to murder him. Now, obviously he wanted to have sex with him, but he didn't, that murder wasn't his mind. And he stabs him to death and he has an explosive orgasm. It's as Gacy later said, it was the biggest turn on in his life. And that set him on the path to homicide.
You write that's when he said, quote, I realized that death was the ultimate thrill. Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second to hear from our sponsor, which is Skylight Frame. The holidays are just around the corner. Looking for a good gift idea that your parents or in-laws will genuinely love? It's hard to find gifts for family members, especially parents and grandparents who seem to have everything. Plus, you want to give them something meaningful. Skylight is the perfect gift. My parents love the Skylight Frame. My daughter in London sends my folks photos of her European vacations, and my brother sends photos from his place in British Columbia. Multiple people can send photos to the frame, so it's a great way to keep large networks of friends and families in touch. It has a black frame and white mat, so it looks like a real photo frame that adds a beautiful touch to your home. Sending photos to Skylight is effortless. Everyone in the family can use the app or just email them to the skylight and they'll pop up in seconds. It's so simple that my non-tech savvy friends and parents could set it up and use it. Now, as a special offer, you can get $15 off your purchase of a skylight frame when you go skylightframe.com, enter code SHOCKING. That's right. To get $15 off your purchase of a skylight frame, just go skylightframe.com and enter code SHOCKING. That's SKYLIGHTFRAME.com, promo code SHOCKING. Now, Brad, we mentioned that now John Wayne Gacy knew that death was the ultimate thrill. At the same time, his marriage was suffering, and you write about what his wife said in terms of their love life.
She was starting to figure out what Gacy was up to, not long after, after about 6 months, she was finding, gay, pornography around the house and hidden and things like that. And Gacy's, nocturnal activities. He would often leave the house at night and not come back till sun up. And of course, he was at that time, he was cruising for young men. And on the Mother's Day, I'm not sure which year, it's 74 maybe. He told her that he was never going to have sex with her again. And that was it. And so, she, I think, Carol Hoff hung on for a while, who's, by all descriptions, a lovely woman. She, hung on for a while, but it just wasn't working for her. And there were parts of the house she wasn't allowed to attend. She wasn't allowed to go into the infamous crawl space or the garage or his office. And, by this time, Gacy's homicidal penchant was starting to get rolling. And she would sometimes leave the house or go visit her parents, take 2 daughters with her, or they would go and visit Gacy's mother, who by this time had moved to Arizona to be with her one daughter, Gacy's sister. And it was during these times that Gacy, for lack of a better word, let his freak flag fly.
You write that he built this contracting company called PDM, and he bragged to other people that he had a workforce that was very, very cheap, and that's why he employed them. At the same time, you write about his wife catching on to what was going on. So there was times when the wife and kids were away, and one time a young, as still identified person, 14 to 18-year-old, was tortured, raped, and strangled, and was stuffed in a storage closet. And Gacy noticed that there was liquids leaking from this victim's mouth. And so from then on, he decided to put either the briefs or a sock or a rag in the victim's mouth. Around this time as well, with his work with the JCs led him to working or volunteering with the Moose Lodge, another service club. He found out about that there was a fundraising element to the Moose Lodge, and this was something with a clown. So he became a clown and had a couple personas, Pogo the Clown and Patches, and start doing fundraising in clown costume. This also led to some of the things that we now learn that he bragged about, also the rope trick and the handcuff trick.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Gacy, for Gacy, clowning, he later said, became therapeutic, where he could get out of himself. And there was a bizarre level of sincerity about doing good works. He would later talk to the detectives about the bodies under his house, as if those boys were nothing, and then be sobbing about some kid that was in the hospital sick that he'd met while in his persona as Pogo. Just to be clear, Pogo was the friendly clown, Patches was the sad clown.
Mm-hmm.
The good and evil, the yin and yang. But yeah, So he embraces this, and through the JCs, he meets a man who hooks him up with the Chicago's, I guess, for lack of a better word, notorious and powerfully Democratic machine.
Yeah. Yeah. And while this is going, he finally, or she, divorces him. his wife divorces him. And so neighbors especially comment that there is a dramatic difference in John Wayne Gacy after this divorce, meaning they see him at all hours of the night, boys coming and going. And also one neighbor noted, as you write, that start hearing screams and shouts and all kinds of strange noises in the middle of the evening.
Well, Gacy, from the time he moved into the house, he had been on a charm offensive with, as he often did, to the point of cloying sometimes with his neighbors. And his neighbors liked him a lot. He would play cards with them. He'd throw big parties and barbecues on the street. And so they quite liked him. But there was, for starters, there were the periodic screams, and then there was the horrendous stench coming from underneath his house, which he always put down to burst sewer pipes and the like. But that was also becoming noticeable, but because they liked him so much, they never put anything down to it. I mean, I think in retrospect that 2 + 2 + 2 = 6, but they just, weren't capable of doing that addition because particularly at that time, who deals with somebody like John Wayne Gacy? I mean, that's not to be glib, but a domestic homicide is one thing. A serial killer next door is, quite another.
So 76, you write that he has a break from 70, he kills at first in 72, you write. And then 75, he starts. 76 is a very, very busy year for him and racks up an incredible body count. But at the same time, there are several incidents where people get away, people have complaints. There are opportunities, it seems, for the police to intervene. But there are people that when they're missing persons report, you have at least one or two parents where they were told, one parent was told because it was out of one jurisdiction, they couldn't deal with it. And when they went to that other jurisdiction, they said, well, you'll have to go back to that original jurisdiction. Nobody would file that missing persons report. And the others were told, look, likely they're going to be a runaway. And they were treated like runaways, these missing people along this route, this path.
Well, yeah. And the other thing is about that, Dan, is where, who these victims were. Mm-hmm. They were from an area called Uptown in Chicago. Many of them were from an area called Uptown in Chicago, in addition to, the kids coming into town on a bus or whatnot, but they were from an area named Uptown, which was a rough neighborhood, largely populated by people from the poor whites from Appalachia trying to get their toehold in the American dream, and more often than not, unsuccessfully. So these kids a lot of them were, and not to say the parents didn't love them, but they were feral children. They were running around wild and, that sort of stuff. And so it would be easy for the police at the time to blow it off. And, in addition, and I talked to LA cops about this, is like with the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, because there was all kinds of jurisdictions and there wasn't the communication that there is now. So, somebody might be snatched off the street here, murdered there, and dumped over there. And so it was, a bit of a logistical nightmare. So, and that was, I think, part of the thing with Gacy. I mean, the police always, and plus, Gacy would always hold up the card that he was he's a Democratic chairman. He was a popular and successful businessman. And who you going to believe? Right. And it would be much different again today, but they would believe Gacy, said, oh yeah, I saw him. He worked for me. I paid him and he left. He said he was going to Wichita or Colorado or California or something like that. And that would be good enough for the cops, and the cops at the time didn't have the tools necessary to deal with a guy like John Wayne Gacy.
You write that it's even interesting where the police had reports of missing persons that were employees of PDM or former employees of PDM and you write about a couple of the employees that become important later, David Cram and forgotten the other gentleman's name. But regardless, these continued. This missteps by police continued completely. But you say that beginning of the end, as you call it, New Year's Eve, 1977, there was a person that, again, got away, and he had a story for police that he was kidnapped at gunpoint at a bus stop and forced into sexual acts. And he said that he pleaded with cops to believe him, but they treated him like he was stoned.
Yeah, he wasn't going to, let this die. Him and his pals, like, he remembered Gacy's car. He remembered Gacy, couldn't tell you where he lived, but, he knew where he'd been taken or where he'd been dumped off and whatnot. And so they thought that he would get on the on-ramp at this particular spot. And sure enough, he did. So Gacy, he goes with this to the cops. He knows that it's Gacy. And they follow him to his home, and they know exactly where he is. And they go to the cops, and the cops aren't really enthusiastic about this. And, so they're going to charge him. And instead, Gacy settles out of court with this guy to make it all go away and to continue on his merry way. Now, this is the first inkling. He's been back in Chicago at this point by for 6-7 years. And despite numerous reports, nobody's linked them all together. And so finally this guy's on the record. They know who this guy is. They know, Gacy is a little bit more exposed by this point.
Another person you read about is Jeffrey Ringnall, and he was determined to find his attacker as well. He claimed, this is very, very interesting, he claimed that there was another man in the room during his torture and rape observing.
Well, there's been, that's been one of the persistent, I think that's sort of what is one of the things that makes the John Wayne Gacy story evergreen, is that it just seemed like there was so many loose ends. What Jeff Rignall said, there's been widely believed that he had accomplices, and there was many more victims. Now, who the accomplice was, we don't know. We have an idea. There's different names that have, crossed the page over the last 40 odd years. There's David Cram. There's Philip Paskey. That's
it. Yes.
And, there's a number of these characters who move in and out of that orbit. Now, Paskey was an employee of Gacy's as well, and he was a close associate. The man called by the Dallas detectives the pedophile's pedophile, and John David Norman, who ran a nationwide pedophile sex ring that supplied boys to very well-heeled perverts. So, there's all these strands. And Gacy was, well-traveled as well. Like, for a man in the 1970s, I interviewed a guy a couple weeks ago who's certain that, he got away from Gacy by the skin of his teeth. He got busted for stealing his car. And this was in Lexington, Kentucky. And he got away by the skin of his teeth and whatnot. And, it's only been the last few years this record was cleared. But it's something he was certain when he saw Gacy. That was the guy he'd gotten away from, and it had the Gacy playbook to a T.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second for these messages. Now, when I mentioned that it was the beginning of the end, as you write, it wasn't so long after there was other attacks. In June, Timothy O'Rourke, he was charged for battery on Ringnall, but in the interim, he goes too far from the people he picks, the people where he picks them. He's got a contract to remodel pharmacies, and it's Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines. And owner Phil Torf, he's talking about renovating this pharmacy, and Rob Peast overhears that this contractor's paying $5 an hour, twice what he's making at this pharmacy. And so his mom, heartbreakingly, is there to pick him up, but also it's her birthday. And he tells mom, just wait inside, and I'm just going to talk to this contractor. And she never ever sees him again. And that is the downfall for John Wayne Gacy, in that, again, this is a person that he shouldn't have messed with. And so soon, Detectives are onto him. You write about, again, what many people have read before about the police coming in and the telltale smell. And the one time when the heat just went on, Gacy would invite these police in his own home because he was under 24-hour surveillance. Eventually, that surveillance drove him batty, and he went to his attorney, which was the first case he had in his private practice. And John Wayne Gacy asked for a whiskey and then told Sam Amirante everything that he had done, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And I mean, he was at the end of it, Gacy spilled his guts. Now, Amirante was a diminutive man, and he said that, no, he used to be 6 feet tall, but the Gacy case knocked a foot off his stature.
Right.
But he said that, Gacy's telling them, and, as Gacy gets up to leave, and Amirante runs out where the cops are and said, don't let him go. Because by this point, and to their credit, when the Des Plaines police are on to Gacy, they're like all in to get him. And I don't think it was any one person's fault or anything like that. Certainly it wasn't homophobia, at least as they insist even now. And, I tend to believe them. They were a victim of their times, the same as, unfortunately, those 3 young men and boys were. But by now, Gacy spills to Amirante, and now they've got him. And he can't, one of the damning things for Gacy was that he was a loudmouth and a braggart, and he couldn't shut up.
Yeah.
And the detectives that were after him weren't the Keystone cops Gacy thought they were. They were paying very close attention to everything they were saying, every cough and spit. And then the horrific work, began to unearthing the bodies from his house, which, was cavalcade of horror, that no, Schlockmeister could ever possibly imagine.
To add to this horror was Sam Amirante and another attorney, Motto, but also the police also got an earful of, again, the braggart, the person that considered these people, it was their own fault. They had it coming to them. They were like trash. He had no remorse whatsoever. Not that you would expect it, but none, even shockingly. But he talked about, because of his big mouth, he revealed, again, nothing, no horror movie could compare to this horror that he even spoke about himself, about what he did to Rob Peast, what he did to other victims, the torture, the rape, and the taunting. Incredible.
Well, yeah, the level of depravity is just staggering. Now, as I'd mentioned earlier, I mean, all these kids, all the kids and young men Gacy murdered were white. And Gacy had said, in one interview that he only killed those who tried to shake him down or would really fight him. But, I mean, I think if I was in the situation of those boys, my inclination would be to fight. I don't think shaking down would be of any consideration. And the tales are horrendous of the tears and begging for their lives. And that seemed to drive Gacy to further heights of some kind of twisted ecstasy. Yeah, and it was horror after horror after horror after horror every day for months. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, that they still haven't. I think there's 5 bodies still that they've not yet identified that, were, underneath his house. One Chicago detective, Cook County Sheriff's detective, has been the guardian of these cases, and he was supposed to specifically be doing Gacy, but he's managed to clear 10 other cold cases in the interim. Just that's how much Gacy, how he still haunts, even though he's been dead 28 years.
You talk about Gacy as well at trials. Very, very interesting. His poor mother was on the stand for 12 hours, and this guy showed no emotion, finally showed some emotion. And oddly enough, they let John Wayne Gacy hug his poor mother at the end of her testimony at trial.
Yeah, I mean, Gacy, was... obviously, he had been hiding in plain sight for years, but he was a man of contradictions. Many of the detectives that brought him down quite liked him on a personal level. But but they all thought he was a bullshitter too. They were very clear about that. And obviously he was very close with his mother, and his mother did what she could do to protect herself or protect him from the father. So he had a close bond with her and with the sisters, and this was just something they never ever saw coming. Like, to them, there was no indication at all. And I have no doubt his mother was heartbroken about it, but it's a horrific story.
This, you say, is still an ongoing case, and there are, as you write, unanswered questions. And one of those is, did he commit any more murders? He has said to a detective, you quote, how about 45 sounds like a good number. And that person believed that.
Yeah, and that's the big part of it too, is that Gacy, as I said, traveled frequently to Florida. He would and also to Pittsburgh, and he would drive. And as we both know, there were a lot of hitchhikers and young people on the road at that time. Here's this guy, might be a bit of a loudmouth, but he's friendly enough and whatnot. Yeah, I'll take a ride with him. It's impossible to think that when Gacy was traveling, down to Florida or wherever he was going, that all of a sudden he put murder on the shelf. Because obviously this was a compulsion that drove him. This was this was at the core of his being by the end. Whoever else John Wayne Gacy may have been, that was largely erased by the time the police brought him in. And he was almost a full-time predator.
There is talk about accomplices, and especially when there is some controversy over David Cram and Philip Pensky working for Gacy. And you say that some say that they must have been privy to some information, if not, again, some sort of accomplice before or after the fact.
Yeah, that's what I believe. Jeffrey Ringwald, saying that there was somebody there when Gacy was, torturing him and raping him. Cram's there. And also at the time, as I mentioned earlier, there was Pensky who worked for Gacy. And Pensky was a transvestite pedophile who, was the main associate of a guy named John David Norman. Was, the most, notorious pedophile in the United States. He had a filing card system of thousands of names of high-powered people, including politicians in Washington, that he would send underage boys to. And so they're all in Chicago at the same time, with Pensky working for Gacy. It's hard to believe that there may not have been some interaction. One of the people connected with Norman was Dean the Candyman Coral,
right,
a notorious Houston serial killer. I think his tally of death was in around 25 or whatnot, and he had close ties with John David Norman, who had been based out of Dallas before he ended up in Chicago. And if you look at the Candyman's MO, it's not dissimilar from Gacy, or vice versa, because the Candyman was before. But, these vulnerable, you go after vulnerable kids who aren't going to squawk, right? And you lure them in with friendship, promises, cool sort of stuff, or jobs or what have you, and you've got them. Now, the Candyman had a number of teen accomplices, including one of whom who, parked a couple bullets in him, which ended his reign of terror. Now that guy's still in prison, but it's coincidence maybe, but you start connecting the dots, that seems like there might be something there. Is it, hard as granite? Not necessarily, but it looks like it.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book, Inside the Mind of John Wayne Gacy, The Real Life Killer Clown. For those that might want to take a look, I know this book is on Amazon right now, all over the place. paperback and Kindle, probably audiobook soon enough. And also tell us about any social media that you do.
I can be found on Twitter at @Hunter, capital T, capital O, capital S, UN. That's Hunter at T.O. Sun. And I also wrote a book last year called Cold-Blooded Murder, which is a collection of about 25 famous murder stories as well. And that's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc.
Well, that's great. I'm sure to check it out. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.
Inside the Mind of John Wayne Gacy, the real-life killer clown. Thank you so much, Brad Hunter. You have a great evening. Thank you.
You too. Thanks, Dan. Stay out of trouble.
You too.